The following interview is a presentation of Ophion Media. It first aired on KXLU Los Angeles. Today, I'm honored to welcome two guests to the program, Alison Dundy, who's joining us from New York, and Dominic Thomas in Los Angeles. Both have translated works by two absolute giants of literature out of Congo-Brazza, Sony Lab'ou Tansi and Alain Mabanckou. Specifically, Alison Dundy is responsible for the wonderful English language translation of Tansi's classic Life and a Half, and she also translated Mabanckou's first novel, Blue, White, Red, a masterful portrait of the life of an undocumented immigrant in France that's equal parts biting and hilarious, which incidentally is probably a fair description of most of Mabanckou's work, and of Tansi's for that matter. And Dominic Thomas did the Anglophone world the tremendous service of translating Tansi's The Shameful State and Mabanckou's Tears of the Black Man, a book-length essay, or perhaps set of essays, that grapples with the status of Black people in France, as well as the self-image of certain African and African-descended people in France and beyond, and many other complex topics. Dominic Thomas is also the editor of the Global African Voices series published by Indiana University Press, a series that includes all the titles I just mentioned and about 15 others to date. So Alison, Dominic, thank you so much for making yourselves available today.
Thank you.
Thank you for.
I want to start by talking about Sony Lab'ou Tansi. Dominic, you actually knew Tansi personally, which I'm very interested to hear about. But before we get to that, and even before we get to discussing the works of Tansi's that you've both translated, I'd like to start with just a very basic description of Tansi and his impact on some of the writers and thinkers who came after him. So would either of you care to share some of his essential biographical details and to describe the effect that his work has had on those who carry on his legacy in one way or another today and a bit in the past as well?
Well, maybe Alison could start by just describing how she came across his work and her interest in the work, and then I can say a few words about how I got to meet him and so on.
Okay. Well, I lived in France for a while and was drawn to African literature and North African literature. I found that the legacy of colonialism, of course, is not the same as the legacy of slavery in the United States, but there were glints and reflections that were so powerful, each illuminating the other side. And there is that dialogue between the Black African writers and Black American writers, and sometimes direct quotes, from Richard Wright and Sembène Ousmane and like that. So I tumbled to Tansi in Présence Africaine, a bookstore in Paris. And I read the book in almost one sitting, I think. It just was, I'd never read anything like it. And I'm
sorry to interrupt, was that La Vie et Demie, Life and a Half?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I like a challenge, and it seemed like a really, really challenging book to translate. And I actually translated Mabanckou first for Indiana. I believe that's right. No, I think it was the other way around because it took a while to get the rights for Bleu, Blanc, Red, Rouge. But anyway, yeah, that's how I found it. And I found it to be a really unique and powerful voice in that he was one of the first courageous critics of the post-colonial regimes and took a lot of heat for that. So there's an honesty that's just compelling. And the fiction is more powerful than any factual account you could read about Mobutu's regime.
And Dominic, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, yeah, Sony Lab'ou Tansi is, as you mentioned, he's that generation before Alain Mabanckou. Sony Lab'ou Tansi was born in 1947, Mabanckou in 1966. The real tragedy with Sony Lab'ou Tansi is that he died young. He died in 95 of complications from from AIDS. He was an incredible playwright and an incredible novelist. And when he was living in Brazzaville, he ran this theater company called the Rocado Zulu Theater. And he would be regularly in France and would attend the big festival of Francophonie and theater that took place every year in Limoges. And I first met him there in 1988, having produced his play in 1987, La Parenthèse de Sang, parentheses of blood, in London at the French Cultural Institute. And very much along the lines of what Alison had said. At the time, I was only an undergraduate at the University of London. And the, quote, discovery of these authors, living authors, talking about contemporary political issues. In the case of Sony Lab'ou Tansi, the post-colonial dictatorship world was something that absolutely fascinated me. And the access to these voices, to these new creative voices coming from the African continent and writing in French. And I really sort of, hitched my wagon to that. And ultimately that passion became my career. And the series is essentially a product of that passion, a desire to bring some of these voices into other languages so that other readers could go about enjoying him. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but it was really his incredible creativity that drew me into this, into his corpus of writings. And then Mabanckou came later on with that.
And I want to ask you, or maybe just confirm something with you, because you can't obviously believe everything that you read online, but about Tansi dying young, my understanding is that he actually became an elected official in Congo Brazzaville, and then it was basically his sort of political opponents or his political adversaries who wouldn't grant him a visa or some kind of documentation to travel abroad for treatment when he became HIV positive.
Yeah, there is some truth to that. I mean, the thing is that, all his work deals with that post-dictatorship era, an incredibly violent era that by the time you get into the 1970s, you have not only coups d'etats, but you have assassinations. And his work is driven by that desire to use the pen as a weapon, as others like Ngugi wa Thiong'o had as well. And so, yes, you're absolutely right that when Sassou Nguesso essentially was ousted from power in the early 90s, before he then returned and is still the current president of that country, a writer that Alain Mabanckou has spoken out, a president that Alain Mabanckou has spoken out against, too, that during the transition and the national conferences, this sort of attempt to sort of run a kind of Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the mid-1990s. Sony Lab'ou Tansi was elected for his neighborhood of Makelekele in Brazzaville, and that really set up a different kind of level of opposition to the authorities. What's so interesting is that in so many sub-Saharan, just to talk about the sub-Saharan Francophone African countries, many writers were either imprisoned or forced into exile. And the small Congo, the Congo Brazzaville, across the river from the DRC, had this incredible relationship in the sense that they were sort of two elites, a political elite and a cultural elite. And what was interesting was the porosity between the two. So you have a writer like Henri Lopez, who is a novelist, a short story writer, but had also been a prime minister, and many other writers that were in power. Sony Lab'ou Tansi, as an oppositional figure, through his theater, through his novels, was of course censored, but did not experience the kind of repercussions that other writers had in other parts of the continent because of his proximity with the state and with the writers in there, some of whom protected him. But during that moment of transition, when he became an actual elected political official, that oppositionality became more tenuous. And it is true that there are complications then around that in terms of the sort of the access to travel, the access to health and so on that he had. But the reality was that he had become very ill by that period in the mid 1990s, and I think unfortunately did not receive the kind of treatment that he could have received and the kind of medical attention that might have prolonged his life or given him some kind of longevity with health and medication. And so that is a sort of a further dimension to that, Adam.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And going off script a little bit, I mean, just obviously a lot of the post-colonial African writers are well known for their critiques of colonialism, and Tansi is a bit unique in spreading the criticism a little wider, beyond just the colonial regime. I wonder if either of you have, because Mabanckou has written about Yambo Ouologuem as well. I wonder if what you could say about any kind of connection, at least just on the level of the spirit of their works between Ouologuem and Tansi. Or if that's maybe a bad comparison, then maybe say why it is.
I'm not sure whether you want me or Alison to go. I think maybe Alison's turn, or if you...
I would appreciate your take on this, Dominic.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that the Ouologuem novel is the main novel is being the title's escaping me. The Devoir de Volance.
Bound to Violence. It's been translated.
It's being reissued and re-edited to incorporate some of the what you might argue were the mistranslations in the early versions, because components of the work were lifted or plagiarized from others, and many scholars, most notably Christopher Miller at Yale, has written extensively about this sort of practice of borrowing and so on. I think that what's important to point out is that there is this moment after the end, or the official end of colonialism, where authors are concentrating on the sort of the process in which society is disintegrating. So if indeed you have a criticism of, say, negritude as having not only a philosophical, cultural, and political component, but and also an element of which is where Ouologuem's criticism is so harsh of that previous generation, is that negritude tends to present, or can present, or be interpreted as presenting a kind of nostalgic view of how African society was prior to the colonial moment. And Ouologuem attacks that frontally, head on, to point out a much longer history of violence, which is necessary to assess both the legacy of colonialism and the process of post-coloniality. By the time you get to the late 1970s and early 80s, so you're beyond the Ouologuem late 1960s, early 70s text, and you get to Sony Lab'ou Tansi, you're really now looking at the disintegration of post-colonial society itself. In other words, the failure of the nation-state experiment, the failure of Marxism, Leninism, scientific socialism, and you have that attack. And it is that attack and that collapse of society that leads to these migratory patterns, which then become the focus of the next generation, which are the sort of the diasporic writers, the writers like Mabanckou, that are looking at what happens when you're driven out of the African continent and when you start to explore and set up residency in France and come into contact with another kind of post-colonial legacy, which is France reckoning with the history of colonialism, the history of migration, and the resurgence of racist practices, issues around integration, racial profiling, and so on, that continue to haunt contemporary France today.
Well, so yeah, because we're talking a little bit about Tansi's work with, how he invokes violence in his writings. There's like the unforgettable opening to Life and a Half, which is just this brutal pages-long torture scene that really kind of, sets the plot running for the rest of the book, and also kind of sets this violent tone that I think, the violence just kind of is the driver of the action to some degree throughout the rest of the book. There's also in the Shameful State, euphemistic reference after euphemistic reference to sexual violence that again kind of just pervades the entire text. And these allusions to violence are just dripping with kind of the most caustic sarcasm you can imagine. I wonder, if we've already talked about it a bit, but if either of you would care to say more about the function that violence serves in these post-colonial worlds that Tansi constructs in his writing, or maybe more accurately, that he reflects through his writings, because violence is sort of at least, at first glance, it's the feature of his writings that I think to a lot of readers could just jump out at you the most prominently. I don't know if Alison wants to go just because so that we can kind of give you both equal time.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this is the best answer to your question. I mean, one of the things that really appealed to me about Sony Lab'ou Tansi is the inherent irony that, I mean, he speaks about French being the language that he was raped in, and most students or most people familiar with French literature think of, the Enlightenment and liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the violence of everyday life under the boot of French colonialism is an essential quality of life that they bring out in their polemic against the rule that they're under, not only in Sony Lab'ou Tansi's case, the African dictators who called themselves Marxists, but were not, in fact, at all. I mean, that too was the irony. To conceive of Idi Amin, for example, as a Marxist is completely absurd. So I think that it wasn't, I don't think that Sony Lab'ou Tansi or Mabanckou had a gave up on ideology or hope, but really ruthlessly exposed reality, and violence is not to be shied from. That's the life there.
Yeah. If I could add something there, Alain, too, because it's one of the things that immediately attracted me to the work. So first of all, the creativity, just the object of the book or of the play is there on the cover. So Sony's name takes from one of the other incredible writers who also passed away relatively young of a heart attack, Achille Mbembe, who was a poet and a playwright and a novelist. And so he's, as an honor to that predecessor, he incorporates that into his name. If you read his early works, the dedications are all to what he calls this fratrie, this kind of family, this brotherhood, this writerhood of Congolese writers. So you have announced on the cover this name, Sony Lab'ou Tansi, which has a sort of a disorienting aspect. And then the choice of titles themselves. So if you look at the earlier generation of African writing, when you take a book like Ferdinand Oyono's Une vie de boy, Houseboy, or Kamara Lai's L'Enfant Noir, The Dark Child, there's no ambiguity about what the book is going to be about. When you take, I'll give you two examples, a play by Sony Lab'ou Tansi, La Parenthèse de Sang, parentheses of blood, Je sous-signé cardiaque, I, the undersigned cardiac, La vie et demie, life and a half. You have absolutely no idea what the work is about. And so there's a disorientation that takes place on page one. Then, and this is what makes challenging the work so incredible, so fascinating, but also needs people like Alison Dundy to be able to translate a work like La vie et demie, which interestingly enough, we're able to acquire in around 2008, 2010 in the series, even though it was published 30 years prior to that, precisely because many publishers shied away from publishing this work because it was so complicated, because it was so violent. And then in the work itself, as Sylvain Mbembe from the Congo said in describing Sony Lab'ou Tansi, he writes as he creates and he creates as he writes. And the neologisms, the word compounds and so on that are there in the work. And Sony Lab'ou Tansi has argued that the process of writing is a process of dismembering language, of disfiguring language, and that a normal language would imply a normal state where you have extrajudicial executions, the disappearance of people, the violence of the state. So the creativity of the language also puts you off compass. It's aimed to be déboussolant, as they would say in French. And through that, he's able to create, to recreate these new imaginary kind of spaces. But to use normal French language to him would be an inadequate tool to describe the circumstances of the post-coloniality. And at the same time, the other language on offer, which is the language of the Marxist-Leninist state, this famous langue de bois, in which makes absolutely no sense, in which other Congolese writers like Emmanuel Dongola so cleverly dismantled in another book that's in the series, Jazébin Palme, where he essentially shows members of the state are using this language, but using it completely devoid of any context. So for Sony Lab'ou Tansi, the entire process is to set you off guard as a reader, produce something that lacks kind of familiarity, and at the same time open you up to the kind of violence that is the daily experience of people living in a place like Congo, where Sony Lab'ou Tansi stayed throughout his life and challenged the political situation and tried to improve the plight of his fellow Congolese citizens in the face of these brutal dictatorships that were hell-bent on dismantling and disfiguring the citizens of the Congo at the time.
Adam, if I could just jump in for a moment. One thought that came to mind regarding the question of violence. So consider this a translation, if you will, something that might be more familiar with an American audience. Richard Wright took a tremendous amount of heat for writing Native Son and depicting Bigger Thomas as the violent man that he was. And I think that there's an analogy there with Tansi's courage. And if you recall Richard Wright in his essay on how Bigger Thomas was born, in rebutting his critics for writing something so true and so real about how oppression oppresses and dehumanizes people and forces them into this kind of life, he said his aim was to write a novel that no white banker's daughter would shed tears over. You know, it was a complete rebuttal to liberalism. And I think that probably explains what Dominic was just talking about, the difficulty in finding a publisher, you know, for Tansi. It was too hot to handle.
Yeah. There's a lot in there that I want to kind of follow up on. And I mean, I think that there was already sort of an answer to this question in what Dominic just said, but I wonder if I could press either of you to just go a little bit deeper on it. You know, one thing that I found really fascinating about both Life and a Half and The Shameful State is that both of those books, they open not with forewords, but with warnings. And, you know, both of these books, at least in my experience as a reader, have a way of really kind of forcing themselves on you in the sense that they grab hold of you and they make you confront some really uncomfortable images and some really uncomfortable ideas that even if they're taking place in this kind of invented sort of fantastical world, nonetheless are sort of a reflection of the reality that Tansi and you know, his compatriots experienced. It's sort of a way of plugging you into the author's trauma, and it's like the only way to avoid absorbing that trauma would just be to put the book down and stop reading it. Yeah, what do you think it is? I mean, about his writing that allows it to pack such a powerful punch?
I think maybe ask one of us to ask Alison. I'm happy to hear Alison.
Why don't you go, Alison?
Well, I think it's with Tansi in particular, it's the satirical quality that packs a punch. I mean, you know, the absurdity of life is so interspersed with sharp portrayals of reality. So for example, when he talks about, you know, it's just an aside, the foreign powers that supply the guides. Well, you know, it's all there, right? What Western democracies so-called democracies are doing in Africa to maintain these regimes. You know, in his language.
And I'm so sorry, I just want to jump in there for the sake of our listeners. In that book, the term providential guide is used as sort of a very sarcastic description of the heads of state in this imaginary nation state. But go ahead, sorry.
No, so it's just, right, you know, the the providential guide who's supposed to lead you into, a future. And he speaks, when he speaks in public to the masses, uses the language as if he's, representing them. And Sony Lab'ou Tansi unmasks all of that with the complete brutality of it. I mean, he, it's just hilarious. And in the humor, for example, the providential guide cannot have sex with the leader of the opposition's daughter, who is the most beautiful woman in the country. She's just, he describes her as, a body that lingers in men's minds forever, and he can't have sex with her because if he tries to do it, the torso of her father, the opposition leader in the country, appears, bleeding in his room. And it obviously totally freaks him out. So, it's, how does he deal with this? It becomes an adventure where the providential guides in the future, like generations hence, have what they call production week. And it's a week when 50 virgins are brought into the palace, and they have sex over 12 days with each one of these virgins in order to have sons, and that's it for sex. And every single one of them is given a name that begins with the letter C. And the next year, it's with the letter D. And then they move on when they've gone through the whole alphabet to numerals. And it's hilarious if you think about the lineages of power and corruption. So I don't know if that's the beginning of an answer. It's just part of what appealed to me about that book. I mean, you get drawn into this world that is out of this world and at the same time so truthful, if it had a flat description in normal everyday language and imagery, it just wouldn't have packed the wallop that it does.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating about writers like Mabanckou, like Sony Lab'ou Tansi, is to just simply look at the library. And I mean by that, the physical library, the printed materials, the cultural upbringing, the background, the diversity of worldviews that are drawn in to work. So educated under colonialism, educated in French schools, exposed to all the classics of French literature. But within that literary tradition, you have avant-gardist novels, you have the French new novel and experimental, you have the violence of the writings of Céline, you have a writer translated into French, as Alison was just mentioning, from Richard Wright and others. The Latin American writers are winning global prizes. Marquez is a frame of reference. And it's not surprising that the sort of analogous colonial histories and backgrounds get treated with the same kind of creativity and so on. There is the way in which Sony Lab'ou Tansi's writing, which by the way is done by hand in these incredible notebooks, often with annotations, speak in a dramatic fashion. And by that, I mean that the role of theater, I think that a work like La Vie et Demie or L'Étante could have been one of his plays. In fact, between the two works, the dramatic corpus and the work of novelistic fiction, you find the crossovers. In his own cosmogony, the relationship between the living and the dead has absolutely nothing to do with the ways in which Western traditions deal with that kind of relationship, the relationship to animals, the relationship to nature. So often what people find disorienting, creative, for Sony Lab'ou Tansi is just part of his normal environment. What's fascinating is that the mechanism through which this material is communicated to the public is initially through what we might call the French language, what we might call francophonie. And writers like Sony, writers like Lopez have always emphasized the plurality of that tradition, that it becomes a vessel through which formal education in a colonial school was obtained, or in a post-colonial school in the case of Mabanckou, and that's the language in which you can write and access a broader audience to communicate these worldviews.
So I want to pick up on that point and actually go back to something that Alison said. You mentioned one of Tansi's maybe most famous quotes, and I'm going to just read a slightly longer version of it, which was that he said, "I write in French because that was the language in which the people I speak for were raped. That is the language in which I myself was raped." And then he goes on to say, "One must say that if between myself and French, there is anyone who is in a position of strength, it is not French, but I. I have never had recourse to French. It is rather French that has had recourse to me." Would either one of you care to sort of unpack this statement for us? Because a lot of times African writers are criticized for writing in colonial languages rather than in African tongues. And actually Mabanckou addresses that criticism in the Tears of the Black Man very directly. But, you know, obviously Tansi seems to have a very different perspective on that question than many of these critics. So yeah, I'm wondering if using that quote as a point of departure, either one of you could say a little bit more about the power of writing in French. And again, I mean, you were alluding before to the fact that he's not just writing in French, but he's reinventing French as he uses it.
I'm not sure how to answer it. I think that Dominic, I think it's an excellent question, and I think Dominic will probably have much to say about it that would be enlightening. All I can say is that I sensed the meaning of what he said, that if there's who conquered was not French, but me, this was the language I was raped in. There is an African voice that shouts in French in his books, and the names of his characters. When Dominic says this could have been a play, one thing that was a challenge for me, and I tried to be really careful about in the translation, was the rhymes, the rhythms, the cadence of his writing in a country where oral traditions were huge, especially where there's tremendous censorship and the printed word wasn't always how things got around, and not in French. A certain elite spoke that. So that duality, it's almost like, you know, the Russian dolls where one is nested inside another. There's an African core, you know, and it's nestled inside this French language. That's the only way I could begin to answer your question.
Yeah, and if I can just add a couple of things, it's wonderful to hear Alison's take on that. Is first of all, unlike former President George W. Bush, for whom Africa was a big country, Africa is not a big country. So the politics of language on just the African continent, let alone the African diaspora, play out in just such a fascinating range of ways, from the South African context, the way in which officially, what were Francophone countries, the politics of language, for example, in Senegal have played out differently. And you have very important writers like Boris Boubacar Diop that have experimented and written and produced in Wolof alongside French, instead of French, etc. You have the most well-known proponent of writing in, quote, African languages, which would be Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in decolonizing the language and so on. And you have the particularity of the Francophone context as it continues on today with a French president and the guise of Emmanuel Macron, who has made francophonie, in other words, the global, what many describe as soft power of France, that allows for an overrepresentation at the United Nations of countries that can communicate in French as a tool of diplomacy that has been embroiled in long-standing tensions around the recourse to this language. I'll just say a couple of things. Mabanckou, for example, speaks 7 languages, from Lingala to Monokutuba to Bembe, and so on and so forth. But he has publicly responded to questions about this, saying these are not the languages in which he received a formal education that required writing and transcription. So he doesn't have the tools to be able to write in those. English is a language that he has picked up later. He speaks in English, he could write in English. but that's not the way in which his creative impulse comes in. But it is impossible, and it is one of the great challenges of translating a writer like Mabanckou, who draws so heavily on the oral components of all of those other languages, which he got from his mother, which he got from his father's side, which he got from the street, which he got from living in Pointe-Noire and then in Brazzaville, and so on and so forth. That is part of his creativity. That is also reflected in the movement of the fashion movement of La Sape and the sort of the recombination of clothes and codes and music that he's fascinated by. But I think that in that particular context, then, language is complicated. What you have then seen in the last 10 or 15 years are these various manifestos and political movements. For example, the Manifesto for a World Literature in French, which of course the attempt to globalize, but then the return through the national, that is French, writers that are trying to separate themselves from that hold that the language has over them. And then back to your initial quote about who in fact is in this power dynamic, it is absolutely remarkable to see the ways in which various French institutions, from the Académie Française to the prize award giving ceremonies, have in many ways attempted to recuperate these international writers that write in French as a way of bolstering the significance and importance of the French language. And I think that one of the most fascinating developments in that area is the fact that Alain Mabanckou is right now a jury member of the Man Booker Prize, not the Man Booker International Prize, but the Man Booker Prize that will determine the writer in the English language in a prize that has become increasingly globalized, that now includes writers from the United States, to select a writer whose language of expression is French, and to have that author sit on that committee is, I think, a really interesting kind of step, because so much of the work that we do in translation and around language is around this sort of this process of mediation, of going from French. In this particular case of the series, it's simply going into English. And perhaps we could talk a little bit more about what that means, but certainly the translation politics are really important here as well.
Yeah. Sorry, Alison, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add that regarding the translation, I've always thought that it would be really interesting if somebody other than me who knew African languages had translated La Vie et Demie, Life and a Half, or Le Blanc Rouge, because I'm sure that there are, in the names, plays on words and things that simply, honestly, were over my head because I don't know the African languages. I could only do what I could do with their writing in French to try and bring it into English and be loyal to their rhymes and rhythms and word choices. The other thing, just regarding the politics of language, what I found really, really fascinating about Mabanckou, Le Blanc Rouge, is that he goes well beyond the story of the African immigrant to the French metropolis and the travails of life there and how brutal and difficult it is. What I found fascinating was looking at the world from the other end of the arc, which an American reader such as myself had never had an opportunity before to consider what the presence of an African immigrant in France means for his family and villagers back home. And in that, you get, when Moki goes back home in Mabanckou's novel, you really see who's speaking what Mabanckou calls French, and in his novel, that's italicized to indicate that it's not the language that otherwise is being spoken. Otherwise, what's being spoken is an African tongue, but then there are these people who have a certain pretension and will speak in French. And that was, difficult to bridge into English, right? And not flatten out and make it appear that, well, everything came from a French source text and now it's all in English. There was clearly in the book, people are speaking African languages, and then there are pretentious people who speak French.
Yeah. But excellent translators like Alison and like so many of the people have in the series know when you have what in French we say ça sonne faux, something doesn't ring true as you're reading. And so there are these remarkable, I'll just give you like two examples that come from Lingala and others. So for example, mourir la mort, to die death, right? And another one would be dormir la femme d'autrui, to sleep someone else's woman, right? So you have these various sort of, linguistic proverbs, sayings, statements that are there. And so as a series editor, I'm working with, for example, with Bill Johnston on one of Mabanckou's novels. There were, lists of areas that as a translator he had flagged that required additional kind of scrutiny. And that includes, and that's why one of the interesting things is not only have we published Mabanckou in the series, but one of the good fortunes is that many of the writers in the series are still living authors, is that Mabanckou has prefaced some of these books, which is interesting, I think, for him to introduce something like The Shameful State, while at the same time writing an intro or a preface to it, but has also worked and consulted on some of these translation kind of challenges where you know that something needs to be done about it. And it's one of the great challenges that we face too in terms of the relationship between the text and say footnotes and explaining things to readers while letting the work sort of do its own job. And we have in the series aired more on the side of allowing readers to discover for themselves rather than providing kind of extensive, encyclopedic like footnotes that explain everything. But some of that needs to be there to explain what's going on in some of these complex works.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to get back to something that Alison was saying, this notion of French that Mabanckou brings out in Blue, White, Red. I just thought that was such a wonderful kind of like, part of what makes his work so powerful to me is it's just so packed with all of these kind of slice of life details that make it feel so real. And the way that some of these, what do you call it? Expatriate characters in the book who are from Congo Brazza but living in France will come back and say, oh yeah, this guy is speaking in French, but he doesn't speak French. Was to me just such a powerful way of kind of capturing this arrogance that some people who you can encounter in real life have. I promised to move on and ask questions about Mabanckou and also about the series in general. I do want to ask one or two more things about Tansi though, if I may, and getting back to what Alison was saying about kind of the challenges of translating a work that's kind of so, even though it's all in French, it's kind of multilingual or multiphonic in a way. I'm curious what it was like for you, Alison, to go through the process of coming up with English versions of so many of the almost puns and turns of phrase in Life and a Half. For example, you have the heads of state in that book with names like Jean Heart of Father. These are the translations that you gave, by the way, not the original French, of course. Jean Heart of Father, Jean Heart of Stone, Jean Calcium, Jean the Heartless, Jean Crow, and so on. Right. I imagine it must have taken so much work and thought, and that in some cases it could be really hard to make a double entendre that works in French work in English if there's not kind of an obvious cognate available to you. So I guess my question is, what is it like to translate such a playful piece of literature where the author is relying on wordplay, not just to be cute or to be entertaining, but to really land some very serious points and criticisms?
Well, I thought it was tremendous fun. I have to say that. And it was a challenge, and it wasn't, you just have to give up looking for dictionary definitions. I could not have possibly have translated the names of the 50 sons born each with the same initial if I had gone for a literal translation of what he said. So for example, one of the sons of John Heart of Stone, I think it is, all the ones that are born with the letter C, was Jean Cacahuète, which is peanut, but that doesn't begin with a C. So I made him John Cashew. Or Jean Kaichu is rubber. Well, rubber begins with an R. And then I thought, oh, well, condom. Condom is, rubber's a slang for that. So I'll use that. And so I just had fun with it. But stayed very faithful to there were 50 sons born with names that began with the letter C. And if you actually looked at the words, you could see that there's a link to what he said. Or, for example, there was a Jean Caillou, which is pebble. So I made a Jean crushed stone. Just had to think about it.
Yeah. But that's the thing of working with these incredible translators. So I mentioned like Bill Johnston. Bill Johnston is also a very well-known translator from Polish into English. And one of the reasons why he was drawn to a writer like Mabanckou, and also one of the reasons why Mabanckou's work, most notably something like Verre cassé, broken glass, is so popular in Polish. It takes place in a bar. A lot of the work that Bill Johnston had worked on takes place in a bar. There are these exchanges, there are these dialogues. And what's also interesting, going completely the other way around from Tansi, is though Mabanckou is not a playwright, many of his works, for example, Black Bazaar and Broken Glass, Verre cassé, have been adapted to the theater. And they're absolutely hilarious performances that take and extrapolate from the text so many of these comic scenes and are, I'm not saying they're easy to adapt, but they are ready-made for spoken word public performances, in the way also that his work, Black Bazaar, he adapted it himself to 2 CDs in which he worked with world musicians, adapting the stories and the songs to that too. So that sort of level of creativity, this capacity to go from the written word to the spoken word to the performed word to the danced word is part of what I think makes these authors so incredibly appealing and exciting.
Absolutely. And I promise this is the last question on Tansi and then we'll move on. But Dominic, you mentioned earlier that you knew him personally. I wonder if there's 1 or 2 anecdotes that you would care to share with us about him.
Well, I mean, the thing that was I was 20 years old when I produced this La Parenthèse de Sang in London. And it's before internet, it's before Skype, it's before Zoom. This is a living author in the UK, when places like Oxford and Cambridge at the time, this is the early 1980s or the mid 80s, were still not teaching living authors, right? I mean, there are these sort of anecdotes about, Oxford French professors celebrating the premature death of Camus because they could finally teach a contemporary author. I mean, this is really the environment in which you live. There's the traditions that are around dead white authors. You have not only a living writer with this incredible play, La Parenthèse de Sang, but I wrote to Sony Lab'ou Tansi through his publisher, the Seuil in Paris, and received a 2-page handwritten note from Sony saying, I've just been to Argentina, I'm on the road, and of course you can produce it. And he said in French, but plays are written to be performed. And so here he gave it, a sort of permission. And he said, the only thing I want is, just send me some photographs of these. I sent the photographs, he acknowledged them. And then because he was regularly at this festival in Limoges, I went over to Limoges, was sitting there in the audience, handed a little note to somebody who went backstage, and Sony Lab'ou Tansi came out 10 minutes later saying, where's this Dominic guy? And I have this incredible photograph sort of on stage with Sony, talking about his work, why I was interested in it, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, when I made my first trip to Congo-Brazzaville in 1994, 1995, he was too unwell to meet me. But all of the surrounding authors, coordinated by the kindness of writers like Emmanuel Dongala, Sylvain Bemba, Guy Menga, and so on and so forth, were all open and accessible to talking both about Sony and about their own works. And so that's really unfortunately where that sad story ends prematurely. But I think just having, like anything, I think for a young athlete who gets to meet their favorite tennis player, that just moment of exchange of humanity, of recognition is something. And certainly for me, carried it forward all the way till the 2000s, where on multiple occasions I tried with different writers I'd sent samples of L'État honteux, I'd sent samples of La Vie et Demie, but no publisher was interested in these works. And launching the series, thanks to Dee Mortensen at Indiana University Press, that is a global leader in publishing scholarship on African literature, that they were open to launching a not-for-profit translation series. So it's a huge, initial commitment in a really difficult world of finding translators, paying translators, et cetera, And I think that today, with all the sort of the politics around translation, of diversifying the world of writing, of having the translators' names on the cover, which we did right from the very beginning, in many ways, now we have 24 titles, Adam, in the series. There are 3 more that are forthcoming, and it continues to grow and hopefully reach new audiences. And just one last thing on that. One of the interesting things too is, of course, in this French language tradition, really the only markets globally in which writings in French are sold are the French market and the Canadian French-speaking areas. Of course, there are parts of Belgium and Switzerland, but in the English-speaking world, these works open up these authors to markets. And unfortunately, there is that commercial aspect of it in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, the UK, where they're also taught on the curriculum. And many of these writers have been invited not only to festivals because of the accessibility of their work in English, but many other publishers around the world who don't read French or have access to French have been interested in acquiring the rights to these works. So they take the English translation, they read it and review it, and then commission a translation into some other language, which gives these writers greater visibility as they make their way forward into the world.
Yeah, I really appreciate that point, Dominic. I mean, getting a book translated into English is the gateway to getting text translated, especially into, what they call languages of lesser diffusion, although that's not necessarily true. But it's really crucial to bring these writers onto a world stage and get them translated into other tongues. I was really interested to hear, Dominic, I didn't know this story, that you reached out directly to Sony Lab'ou Tansi to translate his work. And I actually did the same with Mabanckou. I loved his book. And I don't know, it was a similar kind of audacity. It wasn't, I just loved the book and I thought it really had to be brought out in English. So I wrote to him and sent him a sample, and he said, "Your translation is excellent. Good luck." And because the rights were unavailable. And he said, also good luck with a publisher he was using before Indiana. And so I called that publisher, who said, "Hey, you just can't come out of nowhere and say you want to translate a pre-Renaudot writer." And I said, "All right." Unfortunately, there was Dee Mortensen and Dominic who persisted and got the rights, and they were the most collaborative team to work with. And it was just a totally great experience. And I think what drove it was a shared commitment to these writers and to bringing their works out. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to be a big commercial success.
Yeah. Well, that's amazing to hear, Alison. And it's out of the 24 titles, I can't give you the exact number, but Adam, a significant number of these works have come out of an individual's passion. So, for example, Max Lob's novel 39 Rue Berne, which is written by a Cameroonian who lives in Switzerland and writes in French, is coming out. And Joanna McCalmont approached us because she's passionate about this author and the translation. Hope Gustafsson has translated one of Cristina Alifaras, who's this incredible Italian Somali writer. The Commander of the River is coming out. It's set in Rome. So it allows us to further expand our interest in this Afro-European and sort of, Black Switzerland, Black France, Black Italy component. Pim Higginson translated, and it's remarkable that it was never translated before, Mongo Betty's Cruel City, and included in the preface to it the translation of Betty's 1950s essay, La littérature rose, the criticism of Kamar Alai's novel, which is also in there. So you have a combination of professional translators, of scholars who are passionate about an author and want to see that author being published. The 3 Wilfred Nsonde novels are published by Karen Lindo, who worked on a PhD at UCLA, but is a scholar and a writer and a translator. So that level of kind of engagement and commitment to an author is unfortunately what makes these series work. The challenge that we're constantly facing, and to a certain extent, we've received support from French Voices. We've had some translators come to us with grants. The Belgian authorities, cultural services have helped us. The politics of translation and the funding of translation are incredibly challenging and lead to all kinds of inequities in the sort of the world of publishing. But the series has been driven by this sort of passion of individuals and the people to bring these works to greater public attention, and because they love the works they're translating as well.
So yeah, to kind of shift the conversation and talk directly about Mabanckou, Dominic, The Tears of the Black Man, which you translated, is among other things a meditation on race and race thinking in France and beyond. Alain Mabanckou in that book writes about the jobs that are quote unquote reserved for Black people in France, such as jobs in the security industry. He writes about the ways that ethnic Europeans in France kind of otherize their African-descended compatriots by ascribing to them hyphenated labels like Franco-Cameroonian and by fixating on their accents rather than by really engaging with the content of what they have to say in many cases. And he writes about the ways that also some Africans who have never been to Europe really kind of place Europe on a pedestal, such as an aunt of his who said, and this is a quote from the book, that those who die will always be resurrected. They'll be resurrected in Mputu, meaning in Europe. This is a book that does not pull a lot of punches. And at times it's very critical of white people, but it can be very critical of Black people as well. And so since you translated it, I wonder if you'd mind saying first a few words about how it was received in France, and also about the kinds of reactions that your English language translation generated in the English speaking world. And finally, this is sort of just a very open-ended prompt, but would you mind reflecting on any observations that Mabanckou worked into this book that really stood out to you as particularly noteworthy in one way or another?
There's so many things to say. And to speak about Alain, I've got to just, say a few things. I mean, I could say Alain as a brother. We're both born in 1966 in different parts of the world, and we both end up in Los Angeles. It's remarkable. He's lived in France. He comes to the United States. He's, et cetera. So he had come to the United States to go to the University of Michigan, worked there for a few years as a visiting artist in residence, and then as an assistant professor, and came out to UCLA for a mini conference I'd organized in probably around 2005. I, at the time, had just taken over as chair of the department. We were living in a different world where we actually could have visiting professors come to our universities. And long story short, he came. We have a quarter system. He was on campus in September. The quarter gets going, and I think it was November 6th, he won the Prix Renaudot. The TV cameras arrived. The university understood my argument that would be a very good thing to keep Alain Mabanckou on the faculty. And so we've been colleagues here now for 16 years. We work in the same department. We have same interests. And my interest, so in 2007, I published a book with Indiana called Black France. Then in 2012, with Pascal Blanchard in France, we published a book called La France Noire, in which Alain Mabanckou wrote the preface, having also published around that time his novel Black Bazaar, right? So there's this sort of burgeoning interest in not just the question of the sort of the far right in France, integration, Islam, immigration, but also around the broader question around racial identity. It's at the time when the philosopher, political scientist Achille Mbembe from Cameroon had said that, the problem with the sort of colorblind racial model in France is that the indifference to race is also an indifference to racism. So there's this sort of growing attention. And with this growing attention, Mabanckou published his book, The Tears of the Black Man, which of course is a takeoff in terms of the title of Pascal Bruckner's Le Sanglot de l'Homme Blanc, which is a book about white grievance and so on and so forth. In many ways, a book that explains so much of the discourse in France today around great replacement theories, racial theories that continue to define the most recent French election in France. So as with his novel, Vert Cassé, the influence of previous literary works is absolutely glaring, because each of the chapter headings is based on a major work of literature, whether it's Amin Malouf or Montesquieu from France or Bernard Dadier or Jean-Marc Adiafi. The 12 chapter headings are framed around a previous work of literature. And you're absolutely right that the position that Mabanckou has taken, so I remember in the book, La France Noire, the preface concludes about the dynamic no longer being about the return to Africa, but about talking about the Black question and the diasporic question, about the ici, the here and now. And it's a letter to his son, very much like the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's also framed in now this global reference. So remember that Mabanckou is an admirer of and has written about James Baldwin. So the question of Blackness and Black identity, in the ways in which Mabanckou has addressed it as an ethnic challenge in the Congo, as a cultural and racial challenge in France, and how that then gets reconfigured through his American experience, is what I think gives this book a unique perspective. He's looking at the racial question as somebody born in Africa, who lived for a long time in France, who writes in French, but is also based in the United States. And I think it's that transnational and multi-dimensional perspective on it that is important, and his ability to criticize both, not so much whiteness, but racism and identity politics, and while at the same time being open to criticizing Africans or certain positions on race in his novel, which open him up to a different kind of criticism. And I find that to be an original aspect. And I felt that my background and training was equipped to be able to translate a work that is a work of nonfiction dealing with some of these issues, and also having access to Alain to be able to go over certain sections of the work. So I think it's an important pedagogic tool as well to have. And to answer you in the last part of your question, I know that different institutions in the United States, for example, use this work and also use this work alongside the French. There's a passage in here that talks about Éric Zemmour, and of course Éric Zemmour emerged as this unusual candidate in the French election, further accentuating the role of the extreme and of the far right in France. And Mabanckou was already weighing in on some of these questions, which unfortunately continue to shape French and European politics today.
Yeah, that's a really rich answer. Thank you for that. Yeah, there's more to say, but not really so much time. So I'm gonna shift now to Alison and asking you about your experience translating Mabanckou's Blue, White, Red, which, as I mentioned at the top of this interview, is an outrageously funny, but also pretty brutal picture of the immigrant experience in France. Mabanckou portrays the zeal that many Congolese would-be immigrants have for the European dream, seeing Europe, as this sort of promised land. And he includes characters who reinforce this impression by reporting back to their countries of origin with these kind of cartoonishly exaggerated, if not just outright invented, stories of the luxury that they enjoy as residents of Paris. And he contrasts that with descriptions of the miserable conditions in which many of these same undocumented immigrants actually live, and the intricate hustles that they sort of have to engage in order to survive, and the tremendous risks that many of them are forced into taking, basically just to be able to remain in France. So 2 questions. In translating this book, was it difficult to strike this balance between humor and what to me, frankly, reads as kind of a rather angry critique? And then also, did working on this project affect your own outlook on not, let's say, immigration, but the nature of the immigrant experience? Yeah.
Well, to start on your last point, I don't think it changed my perspective, but it certainly enriched it. And as I mentioned before, it made me look at a dimension that I hadn't really been considering before, which is the impact of the immigrants' experience on their home in Africa, on the people that they've left behind. And I think Mabanckou is particularly powerful in that regard in Blue, White, Red. The continual back and forth between Paris and Congo. I didn't find it particularly difficult to deal with both the anger and the humor. I think that it's really just a question of trying to let Mabanckou speak in English, trying to let his voice speak and not trying to change what he says, not trying to smooth it out. That was particularly, true with Sony Lab'ou Tansi. It's jagged. And there are other translation jobs I've done where, I can imagine an editor would say, well, this is terrible English. I'm like, no, this is how it was, So you just have to be truthful to the author and really try to visualize their words and the scenes. And I found that Bleu Blanc Rouge was really a cinematographic experience. I could envision every single scene of that book. And when you were asking me about it just now in your last question, Adam, the one aspect of the immigrant life in France that I think is palpable but not explicitly spoken is the continual fear of the police and the continual fear of expulsion, and what they call the double peine. You're going to do a jail term and then get sent out of France, often to a country that you're not even from. So I remembered one scene in the book where he's hustling the metro tickets. He knows something is up and wrong when all of the pigeons suddenly fly off a rooftop and move somewhere else, and the cops are coming, and it's moments like that. I just felt the tension of it and I let him speak.
Yeah, that was, sorry, go ahead, Dominic.
Yeah, and what's incredible about the translation, about the work, is that these are exactly the kinds of works that highlight the diversity and the plurality of French history. And unless a writer like Mabanckou, in 1998, tells the story about profiling, this cat and mouse game between the non-white or between the migrant and between the police, describes the topography of Paris, which he picks up again a few years later in Black Bazaar, the neighborhoods, the formation of diasporic communities, of people helping each other, of this famous Congolese débrouillardise, right? This spirit of getting by, of resourcefulness. It doesn't get told. The story of the French, quote, housing projects that are so discussed and talked about and instrumentalized in the media do not get told until a writer like Faiza Gen produces a work called Kif Kif Demain, which talks about these particular areas and writes it as a 19-year-old, a work which very much along the lines of the kind of work that Alison has done on Sony Lab'ou Tansi and on Mabanckou, translated into English as opposed to American English by Sarah Ardizone, who worked very closely with slangsters in the UK to choose the kind of linguistic register that were the rendered. But these are various histories of France that do not get told, in the same way that the children of North Africans arriving in France in the post-Second World War period, their initial stories do not get told until a writer like Azouz Begag publishes the book called The Shantytown Kid, Le Gun du Chahaba, in the 1980s. And so these are the diverse histories of France. And the fact that Mabanckou today has turned to cinema, for example, he just produced a documentary in France about the history of Blackness and so on, which will be screened soon in Los Angeles with English subtitles and so on. I believe some of it is available now already on the internet, is another way of reaching audiences to bring these discussions into the workplace. And this is the work that's being done by many French historians as well, around the pressures to address the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of racism, and so on. So these works are really important tools in order to provide a kind of perspective on these hidden histories of France that result in the kind of haunting today, and explain why you can have a presidential election in 2022 in which every single major candidate weighed in on the question of colonialism, which officially ended well over 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, these are just such rich and kind of multifaceted works. And it's as I was reading Blue, White, Red in preparation for this interview, I was just so struck by, I mean, obviously it was published more than 20 years ago, written maybe more than 25 years ago. But even looking at sort of the trials and tribulations that so many undocumented immigrants face in the United States, let alone, I imagine, still in France today, it's kind of shocking how little has changed and how contemporary this work feels. I mean, if you just gave everybody a cell phone, basically, it feels like it could have been written today. Sorry, go ahead, Alison.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to jump in. When I was just flipping back through Sony Lab'ou Tansi's Life and a Half before our discussion today, I was thinking about how much more current it is, because the book ends with next time the flies, and warfare is done by flies. And I thought, well, with drones today, this is like, it has a whole meaning and resonance that it didn't have when it was published.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, works that are this rich, I think it's almost inevitable that they'll continue to resonate in the ways they resonated before, and then new resonances almost inevitably emerge. I want to just ask a couple questions about the Global African Voices series, and I'm going to aim these mostly at Dominic because you're the editor, but Alison, feel free to jump in as well. I guess and we've touched on this sort of throughout the interview, but I want to just ask the question directly to see what kind of a response it elicits. The focus on these being not only African voices, but global voices. What's the significance of focusing on global voices in this series?
So the series tried to do a number of things. On the one hand, to bring some of the major works of African literature that are untranslated into English. That's a minority of those texts that from earlier periods, the 50s, the 1970s. The primary focus has been to build a series that reflects the fact that as we have entered, let's say, the era of globalization, that African works of literature have also been globalized in terms of their focus. So if we looked at, say, earlier generation writers talking about the colonial era in the 50s, then the anti-colonial era in the 1960s and 70s, or talking about cultural conflicts within the domains in which they were writing. You have writers like Waberi in the series, who initially from Djibouti, writing about genocide in Rwanda. So in other words, not only writing about a political, social, cultural context that was not his own, but bringing out a different kind of approach and corpus too. The other aspect of it that is interesting is that so much of world politics and global politics has led to the displacement of writers around the world. The greatest anecdote really would be Nobel Prize winning J.M. Coetzee, South Africa, now lives in Australia, and some of his works are listed in the Australasia region as works of literature. So identity, belonging, birthplace, and so on are very fluid in today's societies. What remains, though, is the racial marker, particularly around the African continent. And for me, what's fascinating is I think about the European Union that I'm a great supporter of, but I feel the European Union has done a very poor job of fostering transcultural and transnational identities. And in the area in which we find this trans-European identity being very pronounced is around the shared experience of racism. So when I read a novel written by an African author that either focuses on or originates or is writing in Switzerland, in Italy, and beyond the EU, but in the European space, in Spain, and so on and so forth, there is an attempt to kind of build a broader Afro-European, Afropean identity that is dealing with the contemporary politics of immigration, of racism. And those are some of the connecting points in the issues and around which we're trying to build this series moving forward.
And I mean, we've talked about it. The topic has come up all throughout this conversation, but I want to ask directly about the issue of publishing rights. Alison, you were saying that because Life and a Half is basically such a hot potato, it was significantly easier to get the publishing rights just because a lot of publishers had punted on maybe dealing with that work in the past, and that it was this huge effort to get Blue, White, Red. I guess this is really a question for either one of you, but yeah, to what extent is, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this barrier to the proliferation of these works in other languages, and yeah, I don't know, any reflections that you have on that aspect of this industry, of the publishing industry.
I'm sure Dominic knows much more about it as an editor for a publishing house. You know, my very narrow experience with Mabanckkou's Le Blanc Rouge was that the rights were owned by Présence Africaine. And it was just a stroke of fate, really, that I think the rights became available, because Madame Diop, who owned Présence Africaine and had the rights to the book, did not want to sell them. She eventually died, unfortunately, and her daughter took over and was open to selling the rights to the book to Indiana for this series. So it was just a stroke of luck. But I think that it's unfortunate that, you know, it's essentially the capitalist marketplace that keeps voices from being expressed in as many languages as possible.
Yeah, I think Alison just sums up the truth. There is no one way of easily acquiring rights on any particular text. Either they are prohibitive for someone like us, who we run a non-profit series in which I, as editor, have never received $1 for any of the work, in which many of our translators are underpaid by market rates, which is why the series has worked with, in some cases, scholars who wish to be attached to work. Some have come to us with grants. There's no one way of doing it. Some of these rights are owned by now these global conglomerates. So you think you're writing to an editor or the publisher, but the publisher is now owned by some media company, et cetera. It can often be difficult, but there are also agents, and there are French rights agents at the cultural services, at the French embassy, and so on and so forth, who can be extraordinarily helpful. There's also and I say this with no real metaphorical pun intended, that's what's lost in translation. In the United States, the acquisition of rights is for global rights in English language. That is something that French publishers just simply do not understand what we mean by that. Some of these authors insist on, not so much in the series, but there are many authors who insist on their works being sold to an English language market and to the American language market. So there are these kinds of issues that go there. So in some cases, we've been extraordinarily fortunate to acquire texts by very important authors who reach a more significant audience, which allows the series to develop, to better pay translators, to be more competitive for certain rights. And then the other aspect of it is that the publishing world is uneven, and that we are working in a university press, Our publishing schedules are not the same as the commercial market, and we are not, and we will never be in the market for immediate sensational prize winners, because we do not have the capacity for that kind of turnaround. So it's more about building a library that has some kind of coherence and that brings writers into the open, while having a sort of coordinated view as to what it means to put these voices together, rather than just simply have them appear in a disparate set of publishing outlets in which the work doesn't fit into any kind of literary family.
Well, go ahead, Alison. Sorry.
Sorry, Adam, there's just one thing I wanted to add regarding rights, and that is a plug for Words Without Borders. Words Without Borders is an online journal of literature and translation, and they do a remarkable job. They've also brought out some anthologies and books. And my first publication, if you will, of Bleu Blanc Rouge was an excerpt that Words Without Borders published online. And that, I think, helped get more attention to this text. And I'd encourage you and anyone who's interested in reading literature and translation, that's a wonderful source to discover new authors.
Yeah.
Authors you haven't heard of.
Yeah. And social media, and one of the paradoxes, if we can say that, of the pandemic is that the move towards Zoom literacy and other such platforms has allowed and provided, I think, greater visibility for some work, some discussions, and so on. I think of the Radical Books Collective and its creative director, who's one of the translators in the series, who co-translated one of the works by Boris Boubacar Diop, Bhakti Sringapur, does an incredible job of featuring international authors, predominantly African voices, Black voices, and so on. And that kind of outlet, I think, is really key for getting these works out there and having them reach broader audiences.
Yeah, and I do want to just thank both of you for your work on this series and on the particular books that you've both translated. Because it really is such a wonderful gift. And I was saying this to Alison a bit before the interview. It's such a wonderful gift to a reader like me, who, for whom these books in the original French would just be inaccessible. It's fantastic to have access to them. And I encourage all of our listeners to check out the series Global African Voices on Indiana University Press. Yeah, buy a book, read a book. You won't regret it.